If you ever want your world rocked, find a screen reader user, find a keyword only user, find a colorblind user, and get them in front of your technology and see how they interact with it or not interact with it, as the case may be. In New Zealand, 1 in 4 people identify as having a disability. That's 25% of the population. Put another way, that's 1.1 million people, or the entire population of Auckland. And so how are you addressing them? How are you serving them with your product or your service? So the entire population, the entire population of Auckland has a disability. 63% of organizations find that when they focus on accessibility, all users benefit, not just their disabled users. And that's because accessibility promotes things like good coding practice, good design practice, clear instructions and labels, good navigation. I guess the takeaway really of all of these that I want to communicate is that these are all small things that we can do, but they have a really big impact on users and on individuals.
Welcome to the Tech Waka Podcast, where we dive into the journeys of New Zealand's top tech leaders. Your host for today is Jakub, bringing you conversations with tech leaders and innovators from across Aotearoa. Join us as we uncover the experiences, challenges, and successes that shape our tech community.
What if one small change in your code made your product usable to 1 million more New Zealanders? In this episode, I talked to Maia Miller, founder of Aleph Accessibility, about the real-world impact of accessibility, how engineering leaders can drive change, and why accessible design is just good design. Maia shares practical advice, surprising stats, and stories that might just shift how you build your products. Let's get into it. This episode of the Tech Waka Podcast is proudly brought to you by Wires Uncrossed, lifting the standard of software delivery across New Zealand, Australia, and beyond. A big thanks to Wires Uncrossed for supporting the Tech Waka mission and backing the voices of our tech leadership community. To learn more, go to wiresuncrossed.co.nz. Hi Maia, how are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me, Jacob.
We are talking because you are founder of Aleph Accessibility, and I'm really interested in what made you create Aleph Accessibility and what got you into accessibility overall. Can you tell us a bit of a background story of how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, so I moved to New Zealand almost 8 years ago and decided to career change then and went into tech, specifically to front end. And so I was a front end dev for a few years and basically stumbled across accessibility. I was at an agency that wanted to explore it some more, and they put me on it and they said, Maya, go learn about it. And I caught the bug, so to speak, and learned about it. And it was really that intersection between technology and people, but also communication and getting people on side. And it was really cross-functional because it wasn't just technical and dev, but it involved design, it involved QA, it involved product, it involved strategy, all these kinds of things. And it was just a really fascinating field how cross-sectional it was in the business. And also really valuable and really good at the end of the day. We all want to be doing something that makes a difference and that matters. And here was this really gem where I can use my technical knowledge, do something that was cross-disciplinary, and make technology better for a lot of different people. So that's what kind of got me excited about accessibility. And so I did it for a few years for a company and basically then decided I kind of wanted to do it on my own and do it full time and really invest myself into it. So I stopped doing front end, started Aleph Accessibility. The idea being that I wanted accessibility to be accessible, essentially. When it comes to accessibility, there's guidelines and standards, and it can be really dense, and it can be really difficult to know where to start and how to integrate it and how to measure it and how to bring other people on board. So I really wanted to provide the answer to that, especially here in Aotearoa, so that we can start integrating that more into our everyday and the everyday workflow that we have.
Can you make it a bit more specific and tangible for the audience. When we talk about accessibility, what would be the simplest thing and maybe the most advanced thing? What's the range of things when it comes to accessibility?
Yeah. So I like to compare accessibility to like the built world. So when you're creating a building, there's ways that you can create that building in ways that are more or less accessible. So you can think of having a ramp outside, having an elevator inside, putting signs up with braille on it, signage with good color contrast, that kind of thing. And just like we create a building and retrofitting that building with those accessibility elements is a lot harder and more expensive later on. The same is exactly true for the web. So the way that we build the web can be more or less accessible. The way that we write it up, the colors that we choose, the keyboard accessibility that we do or don't include, all that kind of stuff impacts the way that somebody is able to use a website, an app, just like they're able to access a building. So accessibility involves all sorts of things, from color to HTML to keyboard navigation to zooming to labels and instructions. All sorts of different things go into what it means to have an accessible website.
Oh, you mentioned keyboard navigation. This reminds me of my first job in New Zealand. We went to see our client, and our product was supposed to replace their current process. She showed us how she was entering data taken from paper to her current system, and all of it was very manual, and she was using only keyboard. She was not touching a mouse at all. And me and my colleague looked at ourselves and quick realization, we don't have any keyboard navigation at all.
Oh,
so
interesting.
All we have is you need to use mouse. So basically, well, you could use keyboard navigation, but it would go all over the place. So
Yeah.
it would be useless for her. And instead of helping her, our system would just hinder her to do her job well.
Yeah, exactly. So there's two things that come to mind when you're telling that story. The first one is about keyboard navigation. That's something that I say it is super important. And if you're going to start anywhere or you're going to do just one thing, focusing on keyboard navigation is a really good thing to focus on because it impacts all users. I don't know what her story was and why she was choosing to just use keyboard, but it ranges from people who can't use a mouse because they don't have the motor skills to navigate. The trackpad, for example, is really sensitive to them, or they have hand tremors or whatever it is, to users who don't want to, right? When we're filling out a form, we're often just tabbing through a form because it goes really quickly, right? So keyboard navigation really impacts a lot of people. The second thing that I was thinking about when you're telling that story, and it's a really good illustration of it, is the value of user testing and the value of seeing your users using your product, especially disabled users as well. When we do user testing, we sometimes just grab a big pool of people and test with them. If we're not intentional about picking people with disabilities, then we don't get to see them using the technology. It really has such an impact. I remember the first time that I saw somebody using a screen reader for the first time, it changed my understanding of what digital is, because I was considering digital as a sighted thing, and this person was interpreting it in a completely different way. So if you ever want your world rocked, find a screen reader user, find a keyboard only user, find a colorblind user, and get them in front of your technology and see how they interact with it or not interact with it, as the case may be. Yeah.
And now that you have your own business that helps companies implement and maybe understand accessibility, are there any maybe insights from the market, New Zealand market, when it comes to accessibility? Any things that we are doing really well, things that are broken, things that are missing?
I would say that in New Zealand, we are not doing a lot, but there's a lot of enthusiasm. We'll talk legislation first and just the requirements. So
yeah, cool.
In New Zealand, there is requirements to meet accessibility standards. A global standard it's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG or WCAG. You don't need to remember that name, but that's the global standard. Specifically 2.2 AA. Again, you don't need to remember that standard, but there is a standard that exists, and the New Zealand government agencies specifically are required to meet that standard. In New Zealand, we only have that requirement for governments. It currently doesn't exist for non-government bodies right now, unfortunately. So the private sector is not beholden necessarily to do it. There are human rights legislation that requires, you to not discriminate against people, but that's the kind of the state in New Zealand, as opposed to globally, like in Europe, in Canada, Japan, the US. It's a requirement across public and private. And, somewhere like the US where they are suing every day all the time, we see lawsuits all the time against companies because they're not meeting accessibility standards. So those are the requirements. So when you're in New Zealand, and Australia this is very similar to New Zealand in those requirements. So what we see in New Zealand is largely government meeting accessibility or trying to meet accessibility, caring about accessibility. And then in the private sector, it's a lot more, well, actually, I think in both cases, it's a lot more about individuals who seem to care about it. In the private sector, there's still definitely benefits for accessibility, and including that in digital products and finding new markets and having a competitive advantage and creating robust code, scalable code, all that kind of stuff. It's true in the private sector, equally in the public sector. But because the legislation doesn't exist in the private sector, it's seen as optional right now. So yeah, so it comes down a lot to the individuals. And why I think it's really great to be talking about accessibility with Tech Waka is specifically having leaders caring about accessibility and invested in accessibility in the private sector and in the public sector. That's how we advance that initiative and make it part of our day-to-day work, is by having individuals decide really that they care about it and they see the value in it for their organization and for their users, and implementing it for those reasons.
So why should leaders care about accessibility? What's the kind of pitch for tech leaders? Hey, you should start looking into accessibility today.
Yeah. Well, in addition to, it's the right thing to do, like including other people, including people with disabilities, there's lots of reasons. So for one, in New Zealand, 1 in 4 people identify as having a disability. That's 25% of the population. Put another way, that's 1.1 million people, or the entire population of Auckland. So the entire population, the entire population of Auckland has a disability. That's a minimum number as well, because that's people who filled out on a survey, ticked off a box saying, yes, I have a disability or require a certain amount of support. What it doesn't include is things like temporary or situational disabilities. For example, I'm a right-handed person. And so if I broke my right hand or my right arm, that would impact the way that I use technology. But hopefully I would recover from that injury. Therefore, that makes it a temporary disability. That number, that 1 in 4 number, also doesn't include things like neurodiversity. A lot of people, we're learning more and more every day about neurodiversity, about ADHD, autism, dyslexia, all that kind of stuff, dyspraxia. More and more people don't necessarily categorize that mentally as, in their minds, as a disability. Or maybe they do recognize it as such, but if they don't have an official quote unquote diagnosis, then, can I call myself disabled because I have ADHD, but I don't have an official diagnosis, right? So that kind of thing as well. So the number of people that are impacted and that do have a disability, and then, we include people as well, like as we age, our eyesight gets weaker, our dexterity gets weaker, our cognition. So, we have older population as well. And then just a whole category that we don't necessarily think of when we think of disability, like colorblindness. If you were to fill in a form and asks, are you disabled? But you are colorblind, you might not necessarily say, yes, I'm disabled, but accessibility considers that as well, right? So there's all sorts of people. At a very minimum, we're talking about 1 million people in New Zealand alone. And that number is relatively proportionate if we're going globally as well. So what does that mean? It means that there's a lot of people in terms of who you can target, who you can serve, your target market, your user base. A quarter of your users are likely disabled in one form or another. And so how are you addressing them? How are you serving them with your product or your service?
Are there any other second degree consequences of actually applying accessibility? Anything that leaders would care about, that if they implement accessibility, they almost get as a bonus or yeah.
Yeah. So accessibility is really great that it has ripple effects and positive ripple effects that 63% of organizations find that when they focus on accessibility, all users benefit, not just their disabled users. And that's because accessibility promotes things like good coding practice, good design practice, clear instructions and labels, good navigation, that kind of stuff. It brings us back to those first principles. For example, a lot of accessibility, when people think of accessibility, they think of ARIA tags. Okay, so let's throw a bunch of ARIA tags on our code base and that'll make it accessible, right? But actually the first rule of ARIA is don't use ARIA. Your best bet is to use HTML and to use native HTML. So if you have an input field, use an input field and then use a label to label that input and connect it with a for ID. If you have a button, make it a button. Don't make it an A tag with a role equals button and then an ARIA label with a label, complicated things like that. So it really streamlines a lot of your code base, takes it from being something that's more complicated where you add ARIA tags and then of course you have to remember to update those ARIA tags and test those ARIA tags, and it just makes the code base bigger and more unwieldy. It encourages us to really focus on what an element is and what is the thing that we're trying to code and create and do the simplest thing possible for that. And then that, of course, is more scalable, more robust, and just has longer longevity. You don't need to refactor it as often. There's one thing that I wanted to add kind of when in thinking about that in the kind of additional effects is we're in the age of AI right now, and companies and organizations are throwing so much money and time at AI without even thinking twice about it and without even having evidence of ROI and knowing what they're building. And so how do we measure how much we're throwing into AI and knowing that we're getting the return that we want and need? And of course, we know that what AI produces is fragile code, is a mess of a code that now your devs are going to go have to clean it up, all that stuff, right? And companies are so willing to spend money on AI. Versus accessibility has been around basically since the internet started. And ever since the internet started, we've been talking about how it benefits organizations, how it targets people who don't normally get included in target markets, how it creates code that is more robust. It creates user experiences that benefit everybody. Back in 2001, an American company called Tesco, they decided to do accessibility. And so they created a separate website from their main website. They had a main website and they had a separate one that was accessible. And within 2 years, they dropped that quote unquote main website and they just used that accessible website because they found that although accessibility was designed for disabled people in mind, all the users preferred the accessible website.
Since you mentioned AI, and I know how important the foundations are for AI to work really well, the foundation in data, in or completeness of information that we have. And I also wonder if we think about some of the agents that are now becoming popular, like even the OpenAI or ChatGPT agent that you can launch. I wonder if accessibility built into products can help those agents do their tasks easier, because maybe they will be able to navigate our website in a more confident way, and they would understand the website better because it was designed and implemented in the way that makes it easier.
Yeah, that's a great point, because ultimately what AI and what LLMs are robots that are
exactly
reading other code, right? So they're code trying to read other code. So if you're creating predictable code that is to standard and to best practice, then it makes it predictable and it makes it easier for that agent to read and understand what you're trying to do, because you're essentially, that's its language, right? So you're trying to talk to it in its language. It's kind of like if we were using half the English and half gibberish, it would be really difficult for somebody to understand what we were saying, versus if we were really focused on making sure that our English is clear, it'd be a lot easier for somebody to understand the instructions that I'm giving, for example.
Yeah,
that's a great
point.
And
would you have any piece of advice for tech leaders who are now thinking, I would love to actually have this conversation with my either senior leaders that I work with or maybe with my teams? How would they start this conversation?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it's great to take it on and recognize the importance of it. I think that's a major first step. And finding community as well with other people within your company, I think will be really motivating I think you'll be surprised by how many people are in your company who either have been noodling away with accessibility, have been thinking about it, really care about it and take a passion for it. And that can be really invigorating and make any initiative that you take longer lasting. So for one, I would try to, I guess, tell people and advertise it to your team saying, hey, I care about accessibility and I want this to be something that we do, and brainstorm from them. So that's one thing kind of in your vertical, so to speak, and recognizing the leadership position that you have. You're able to be a role model to the people that you oversee, and you can share with them that this is something that you're taking seriously and that therefore they can take seriously as well too. In terms of the leadership going horizontally to other leaders, I think this falls to really any kind of convincing is finding the language and finding their motivations and the things that convince them. So product, for example, cares a lot about adding value and like customer value and return on investment and driving up sales and all that kind of stuff. So focusing on the market value of targeting that quarter, that 25% of New Zealanders. Are your competitors focusing on those people? Maybe that's a way to have a competitive advantage against your other competitors, that they are trying to focus on just pumping things out. But if you're focused on really catering to your users, then that's your competitive advantage. In terms of design's thinking about user experiences, right? So in the name is user experience. So talk to them about their users. Who are they including in their users? Is it somebody who looks and acts and talks just like them? Or are they thinking wider about different cultural groups, different abilities, different situations? And then you can explore with them. Is there a way that we can include in our personas, for example, somebody with dyslexia? Just throw that in there. And that'll just be that signal to the UX designers that, oh, we need to be thinking of more people. And that's a small stretch, so to speak, but then you could like having people who are low vision. A lot of people think about accessibility, they think of fully blind screen reader users, and accessibility certainly helps those people, but it helps a lot more people as well. In fact, the majority of people who use screen readers are not fully blind. So a lot of them are using screen readers to supplement their low vision. So by including low vision in your user personas, you're really hitting a lot of people. I think in terms of like the QA vertical, is it kind of a similar thing? QA cares about quality. I find when I talk to QAs, cares about quality as well. So as tech leaders, we're thinking about quality and robustness. I think QA leads can be a really close ally in this. So I think it's about focusing on what speaks to those people and speaking their language. And accessibility really does fit into all of those verticals. Like I talked about, it's a really cross-functional discipline and area. So it really can apply to everybody.
I also have a story. We were building a product for, I think, French market that had quite strong regulation that we had to include accessibility. And in our tribe, we were, I think, the first team that had to implement accessibility from scratch. And because we were learning, the testing took us maybe a bit more time. Learning about how do we do it well took us a bit more. So there was a bit of probably frustration from other teams and leadership. Hey, why are you so slow? It was really hard to explain that, hey, we actually need to invest a bit more because we are first doing this thing. And it was also 10, 12 years ago. And one thing that we did that really was impactful was we had this monthly demos for the whole line of business. So we would have all 5-6 teams coming together, just sharing what we built in the last month. And we decided to just show why accessibility is important, but also the whole process that we are putting into building accessibility in. And I know it was not ideal, but it did the trick. We basically had to do role playing when we were doing demos. So we would pretend that someone presenting is one of the users. Maybe there's a different user sitting somewhere in the audience, kind of pretending you're doing some of the work as well. And we got the presenter, he used a blindfold during presentations. Mm-hmm. He was in the front of the room and he put the blindfold on and he said, hey, today we're going to do our demo of our new feature, but we're going to pretend we cannot see the screen. and we showed how we can actually use it. And there was maybe 40, 50 people in the audience, and you could hear how they started being very silent straight away. And after we finished, that also triggered probably the highest number of questions from everyone in the room about how we build it, how it's possible, and how we test it, including with some of the stakeholders. Suddenly you're realizing, oh, that's what you're doing. Okay, now we understand the value of it. Now we understand the complexity of it. Now we understand the efforts to build it. And now you're the only team that can do it actually. And that's awesome. So that was one way that we did it to show the impact, but also the effort we are putting into it. So, it's almost like show, don't tell, talk about accessibility. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of value in show rather than tell when it comes to accessibility. And I think a lot of the times when people look away from accessibility or turn it down or say it's too hard or too difficult or too whatever it is, it's more out of not knowing than it is out of any truth to that point that they're making. Is the people who were saying, oh, like what's taking so long, it's just they just didn't know what accessibility was. And the people who say, oh, we can't do it, we can't build it, it's not relevant to us, it's that they just don't know how it is relevant. And once you see it, once you learn about it briefly, even briefly, right, where you have a moment where you see somebody using a blindfold or just their keyboard, then it's a real aha moment. Yeah, using things like lunch and learns or retros or any sort of presentation moment that you have in like sharing, like knowledge sharing that you have in your organization, that's a really good time to talk about accessibility. And you don't need to be an expert either. I'm sure that you and your team, the more you learn about accessibility, the more you realize you don't know. And
we're not experts.
Yeah. And so I'm sure that that's how you felt as well, that you were like, I don't know, we'll just show them what we have and hope for the best.
Exactly.
That's really the right attitude. Is you don't need to be an expert in order to bring it to a lunch and learn or to a knowledge share. You can just say, hey, I read this one article last week and I thought it was interesting and I thought I would share it. Or I was listening to this one podcast.
Yeah, I listened to this podcast with Maia and,
and decided that I wanted to share it. And here's a tidbit that I learned, and get the conversation started. And it's really more so about learning. And then once somebody learns, like learning is exciting and interesting. So once you share that one tidbit that you picked up from this podcast today, other people will bring up other tidbits that they have and learn. And that's how the excitement builds. Yeah. There was another thing that I was thinking when you were talking about it, and this might be a little bit of a tangent, but I was thinking about this idea of like convincing other leaders and other people in our organization about it as well, right? And they're saying, what's taking so long? And sometimes we think about, well, is it really relevant? This person with a blindfold, well, how many blind people are using our product, right? And so I was thinking earlier today about how it's really human. This is just a human thing, that humans are really good at making generalizations out of a specific thing, but we're really bad at doing the reverse. So if somebody, we see it all the time, like that's what stereotypes and like are, and it doesn't have to necessarily be negative, but somebody cuts me off in traffic, and I look over and I see a characteristic about them. And then it's really easy for humans in general to take that characteristic and say all people with that characteristic are bad drivers. But then when we look to our friend who has that characteristic and say, well, it means that my friend is a bad driver because they have that characteristic, doing the reverse, humans are just not good at. So I think about the statistic about 1 in 4 New Zealanders have a disability, and how that means that a quarter of your user base has a disability. And I get a lot of pushback of, oh no, we don't have any disabled users. And so it's that reversal. So it's recognizing our bias and recognizing our, like, the logical fallacy that exists. I don't know if this is technically a fallacy, but like the way that human brains work. So one, recognize it, and statistically that's untrue. But the second thing also is, don't you want that user to be that person to be your user? In that example where somebody in that demo that you had where somebody put on a blindfold, and it may make you wonder, do we have blind users at all anyway? don't you want blind users? They still have money that's good as anybody else's money. And if you're not in the for-profit area, maybe like you're in a government agency or like whatever your metric is, like people with disabilities still engage with your content. And if not, they engage like even better than people without disabilities. Because if you think about it, somebody with a disability, if you need to go grocery shopping and you find all the websites really difficult except for one to use, you're going to stick with that one website, right? You're going to do all of your grocery shopping with that one website. So they're really good, loyal users to have. Don't you want them to be part of your user base? So focusing on accessibility is actually a good thing in so many ways. And it really broadens who, like the appeal and who actually can use your product.
And just to wrap up a bit and maybe give some tangible actions or takeaways for our listeners, is there one small thing or a couple of small things that the product or engineering team could do this week or next week, in the next sprint planning, what they're planning, how could they embed accessibility or at least thinking about accessibility?
I'll throw a few things out and, listen to just pick one thing. There's lots of different things you can do. And the point is to just pick one. So the first thing I would say is kind of what we talked about before, is making it known, getting it out there, building a community essentially. At your next sprint planning, say that, the next sprint or the next quarter or whatever, you want to have a focus on accessibility and get people interested. And it might look like starting up a Slack channel for accessibility or having monthly meetings or something like that. It doesn't have to be anything big. And again, you don't have to be nobody has to be an expert, but it's about coming together and supporting each other and keeping the enthusiasm up. And you'll be surprised by how many people have ideas on what they can do. So that's the first thing that I strongly recommend. Other things, there are free tools that you can use, a bucket load of free tools that you can inject in all parts of your workflow. Talking about tech-specific coding specifically, there is linters that we can use. There's scanners, automated scanners. There's a Playwright. There's a testing library that you can use with Playwright or whatever testing engine that you have that is essentially plug and play. And then, so it's that testing library. It's called Axe, like the weapon Axe. Most accessibility automated tools are based on that testing suite or that set of rules, essentially. And it's just that set of rules is used in different ways. And so you can include that in your code base and it can automatically detect accessibility issues. Automated accessibility isn't perfect. It's not great even. It only catches about 10 to 20% of accessibility bugs. But you might as well be catching those bugs, right? Instead of letting them slide. So that's a really great way. And then it also acts as an education piece too, right? While it points out bugs and you can see them. So I would strongly recommend using free accessibility and they're free as well. So that's really great too. So doing that. We talked about lunch and learns, that's or whatever sharing kind of thing. So after you listen to this podcast, share about it, talk about it with people. That's a great way to get the motivation from other people. And then when it comes to actual what accessibility looks like in your product, it'll depend on your product and the state of your product and what you're currently working on. The things that I would recommend focusing on are things like keyboard accessibility, getting in automation, color contrast, heading structure, and your forms, focusing on your forms, things like inputs and labels and things like that. Those are just some areas to focus on. I guess the takeaway really of all of these that I want to communicate is that these are all small things that we can do, but they have a really big impact on users and on individuals. Implementing, like I was talking about the automated tools, right? Using automation is a really great way to get that baseline and to catch some bugs because it'll catch, an image that doesn't have alt text, for example, and it'll flag, hey, this image doesn't have alt text, and you can include it. And now in somebody's actual day-to-day life, when they are doing their online shopping or they're trying to log in to their banking or whatever, and they encounter a button that's an icon that doesn't have alt text before, so they didn't know what that button was. Because you included alt text, now they know what that button is and they can get that much further. And so they can use their product, but they also can gain independence, can just do things in their lives without asking somebody else to help them out. So when it comes to accessibility, there's a lot of actually quite small things that we can do that really have a big impact on individuals.
These are some excellent tips, Maia. Thank you for joining us, for sharing your wisdom and experience. I'm sure we have learned a lot from you and from this conversation. It was great to have you here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me so much.
Thanks again to Maia for the insights and the energy. You found this episode interesting? Share it with your team and try one of the tips that Maia shared with us. Let's help build better tech for more people. Also remember to subscribe to Tech Waka and join our newsletter on LinkedIn. Cheers.